So this is the second part of our introduction to Pandas data frames, and essentially what I've done just in the last video is just set up a little data frame, and I was just looking at a couple of row indexing procedures. Okay, so what I'm going to do actually is just look at columns for a moment. So essentially what I've done here is set up a data frame called df. Okay, and I'll just amend what's above here, just to give us a sense of what it looks like. So that's the data frame in its entirety there. Alan Robinson, Kevin O'Brien, Diane Cooper, Patricia O'Connor, and so on. So essentially what I want to do here is we have 4 columns, okay? And what I want to do actually is just want to be able to pick out column. So just actually name the column, okay? So the column's name is column, okay, in column 1. And so just in quotation marks, and put that in square brackets, and we have the column, okay. Name of column 1, type object. Object, in this case, essentially means string data, but could mean other things like dates, but essentially what it's definitely not is numbers, okay. So, let's just jumping around a little bit, okay. So let's get the values. That's just an array of the values there, okay, and you can just write them out as a little list, okay. So just actually as a remark, I'm not going too much into the reading through this sort of stuff here on YouTube, but it's the Pandas data frame is linked as a collection of columns rather than a collection of rows, okay. Thus, it is very fast and to access and manipulate data in columns rather than rows. Okay, so and it's important to use appropriate data modeling techniques to convert available data into a more accessible format. Okay, so essentially, just work in columns or make as much use as you can out of columns. So anyway, what I'm going to do actually now is actually just talk about inspecting a data frame. So I have the data frame set up, and I've actually sort of covered a bit of this material already, but I'll just go back over it again. Okay, so above we have a data frame called df. Okay, so the first thing I can do here is df.info. Okay, and this gives me essentially it just is some metadata about the columns. Okay, and like for example the type, so 4 null objects. Okay, that's actually quite interesting when you're dealing with missing data. Okay. When there's missing data around the place, just to actually see how many objects are, how many missing values are around. Basically, how each column is structured: object, object, object in 64. A little bit there about the number of columns, the number of rows, and so on, and also the types. Okay, so just actually remember to put in the open and close brackets there at the end, because if you don't, this is actually sort of just to sort of put in those brackets, you get that. That's not exactly what we're looking for. It's not a million miles away from, like, you know, it's not an error message, but it's not really what we wanted. So just don't forget to put in the brackets there. Okay, that's the intended outcome. That okay. So let's move on. Columns index. Let's get a look at the columns. It actually just names the columns. Okay. What you could do also is that just actually prints out like how the indexing of it's a string. What actually? Do you know what is that? What actually is that? Let's find out. Let's look at useful command. Always is type. So it's a pandas index base index. Okay, all right. And that's grand. It's just as actually sort of overcomplicates it. It adds a bit of clutter. Okay, so that's grand. I don't want it too much. So what I could information. So what I can do here is actually just write it to list. Actually, just that converts it to brackets. There we go. So what actually? So that's just a nice simple list of the column names. Okay, just actually what is that? A list, of course, because it's to list. Okay, nice simple data structure there. Okay, so we'll leave that as it is, or as it was originally. Okay. Okay. Now the index is essentially just the get the index. So it's essentially a range index from 0 to 4 in steps of 1. Okay, that's a simple enough idea in this particular instance, because it's just essentially it's just 0 to 4. When you don't include 4. Okay, and again, something I'm always curious of is the type. It's a range index. Okay, so that's a useful one. In this particular example, it's something we know already, 0, 1, 2, 3. So, but in other more complicated examples, it is a very useful piece of information, particularly when you're dealing with date times, actually. Okay, so not that it's hugely illuminating in this particular instance, but if you have a sort of data set where you're working with date time data, and the date time is the index, that would be much more useful. Okay, so the head. This is a very useful command. It gives us this, like, the head is actually, well, actually in this case the head is actually the whole data set. But essentially what it is here, it actually prints out the first 5 cases. Now we don't even have 5 cases, so it just prints out the first 4. Okay, but I mean, if you actually had a really, really long data set with like something like 10,000 cases, you know, you can't be looking at printing out the whole 10,000 cases. So what you can do here is just print head, just to get a sense of what the data looks like. And you can put in this additional value there. The default setting is the first 5 values, but you can change it to 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever, just like if you want to just change it around a bit. You can also actually, there's additionally also tail. Okay, and why tail is useful is it tells you how many cases there are altogether, or what the last index is. Okay, so again, that actually just has that one extra piece of information. Okay, so I'm just going to put that back to the way it was. Okay, head 1 is just the first instance there. Okay, now describe. I'm going to talk about describe again shortly. Okay, but essentially what it does here is, it's a very useful command for statistical operations. And essentially what it does here is it calculates, it picks out all the numeric rows or columns. Okay, now in this particular instance, we only actually have one numeric column, some random numbers. Okay, so it's not, if there was more numeric columns, there would be more columns presented here. Okay, so it presents the count, which is the number of non-null cases, or the number of cases anyway. Mean, standard deviation, minimum. These are the quartiles. Okay, so if you're not sure what the interquartile range is, that's what it's. This is essentially the median, the first quartile, and the third quartile. So it actually gives a sense of, you know, how to calculate the summary statistics for a column. Okay, that's actually worth a bit more discussion at another time. So just actually sort of, or actually let's do, no, I'll continue it on down here. If you want to pick out, values, there we are. If you want to pick out columns from the or values from that report, okay, essentially what you can do here is use this lock, which is location, and just give the name of the index. Okay, so let's just do this here. Dot index. There we are. Okay, those are the indices. Okay, so essentially, if we type one of those into the argument for lock, let's try out mean here. Or no, let's try out 75%. That gives us the third quartile, the 75th quartile. Let's try out the minimum. Just remember, it has to be case sensitive. Okay, so if I typed in capital M here by accident, error. Okay, so just put it back to the way it was. Grand. Okay, now the length, the number of rows in a data frame. Okay, so the length of df, essentially, that's a very simple one. I probably should have had that up a little bit earlier. But how many cases there are in our data frame? len length. Okay, let's just see, for argument's sake, does that work with particular columns? Okay, just say for argument's sake there was some operation you need to know the length of a column. Okay, there we go. Yes, it does work for columns also. Okay, now for looking up details about a data frame, use dir or help. Okay, so that's all the sort of available objects. That's probably worth a video in its own right. So I'm going to sort of leave that alone. Help.lock, and that is help on location indexer. Okay, so that's handy enough stuff to know, but that's one thing you should probably read yourselves, or just like make a note of it and then follow up on that yourself. That wouldn't be suitable for YouTube video. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there actually and pick up again at manipulating data in the next video, which is part 3. So this is the end of part 2.